Welcome, everybody. We are so excited to have you here today for our May Plants, Pests, and Pathogens webinar. This is Charlotte Glen, the NC State Extension Master Gardener Program Manager. I'll have just a few opening announcements before turning it over to Barb Fair, who is our guest speaker to talk about trees. Then we'll roll into our Be on the Lookout with Matt and Mike to talk about various insect and plant diseases we need to be on the lookout for the coming months. Then I will close things out with our Plant These for Pollinators feature and a few announcements. And just heads up, our Plant These for Pollinators will be about Threadleaf Coreopsis today. We'll learn all about it. Just want to make sure everybody has the Great Southeast Pollinator Census on their calendar. This is a wonderful community science project that we can all be part of, no matter what your age, what your knowledge level. You can count pollinators and submit that data to be used to track pollinator populations across the Southeast. You can also use this as a wonderful event to offer pollinator education and get people interested in pollinators and help them understand what they can do to support pollinators. It is August 21st and 22nd. So if you don't already have that on your calendar, be sure to add it and plan to count that day or potentially host a counting event at your demonstration garden or some other type of educational event. There are lots of resources available that Amanda Bratcher, who is the Great Southeast Pollinator Census Coordinator here in North Carolina, has posted on the Great Southeast Pollinator Census NNC website. And if you really want to brush up on your pollinator ID skills, there is a wonderful course being offered starting June 16th through University of Georgia. They have a whole variety of guest speakers, including Amanda will be one of the guest speakers. It is the Great Southeast Pollinator course. It is totally online. It's once a week, June 16th through July 28th. And each week will cover a different category of insects as the categories are arranged the same as you report them for the pollinator census. So it is $50 and registration is still open. So I encourage you to check that out. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Barb Fair. I'll introduce her first. She probably needs no introduction, but we are delighted to welcome Dr. Bob Fair as our guest speaker today. Many of you, Barb, as our Extension Horticulture Specialist for landscaping, arboriculture, and urban greening. She is definitely a familiar face to Extension Master Gardener volunteers and Extension professionals across the state, and a returning favorite on Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. I was looking back, Barb, over the years, and this is at least the fourth time you've been our guest speaker. So we always appreciate you joining us and the wonderful work you do across the state with the green industry and communities to support green infrastructure and healthy trees. And you are also an associate professor in the Department of Horticultural Science, a certified arborist, and a member of the International Society of Arboriculture. So there's no better person to join us today to help us better understand how we can care for trees, which are definitely one of our most valuable landscape assets. So welcome. Thank you.
Cool. So when you all asked me to talk about this, it kind of was like, what do we know about trees, or what do I maybe know that I want y'all to know? So keep in mind, because trees live such a long period of time, it's very hard to do research on trees. So you have to be in for the long haul, so to speak. So today we're kind of going to talk about what do we know. When I say what we guess, well, that's because, of course, again, it's tricky. They're complicated organisms, and so doing research on them is also complicated and takes a long time. So I'm going to refresh you on a little bit of tree biology that you might not know, and then kind of put it together. What does it all mean, and how do plants respond to stress physiologically? And how do we prepare for what's the unknown, meaning how is our climate going to change? How do we manage changes in urban and suburban environments? And so I thought it would be quite appropriate to talk about stress, because certainly the past year has stressed plants extensively, certainly even woody plants. Remember, we had a really cold winter for most of us in the state, but we also had a dry winter. We don't always think about those two things going together and causing stress for plants. We always think about drought and stress, and heat, but so both of those things put together kind of cause these issues for plants. Now, I say this all the time, trees are super resilient, and that's a really good thing, right? So they have kind of developed the ability not only to live a really long time, but they also have to defend themselves against stress and damage because they can't move out of the way like animals can and stuff. So they have to adapt to changes. The trick here is, and I want you to keep this in the back of your mind as I talk about it, is that it's easy for trees and other plants to become adaptable when the changes happen over a slow period of time, over years and years, right? But we're not having that kind of change anymore. We're having much more rapid changes. And so it's much harder for plants to adapt to those more frequent changes and often extreme changes. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. There is a body language to trees, and I'll talk about kind of what the heck does that mean. There's actually a book called The Body Language of Trees. It was written by a guy over in Europe, Klaus Matic, and he's an engineer or something. So that makes it a really cool aspect of how do trees work and is there engineering in trees? And of course, there actually is. And so we know that the growth, we think about different species, how they grow, their genetics. So yeah, different species grow different ways, but all plants have hormones and they have other chemistry that help kind of dictate what happens in that plant, particularly when it comes to stress. You're going to see pictures in this presentation from my trip out west last summer, where I finally got to do my bucket list and go see the big trees. So we have some redwoods and we have some giant sequoias, and there's no way, if you haven't been there, to express the amazing nature of these trees and the life spans of these trees and just how blessedly big they get. So it's really cool. And as a tree person, looking at the differences between redwood and giant sequoia, right? Redwoods are big, wide, but they're tall. Giant sequoias aren't quite as tall. They're still really super tall, but they tend to be wider. So just even that difference alone was just so cool to see, and how the bark differences and so forth. But they all obviously have adapted to these very specific climates out there. Now, we can grow some of them here. We do plant coastal redwood here frequently. I have one in my front yard. It's supposed to be a dwarf. So it grew in about 10 years to about 60 feet tall. So it grew pretty quickly. But I've noticed it does not like the heat here. So the humidity is great, but the heat is not so great. So I do see some dieback on those, on some of the inner branches of that redwood. So these are American elm, right? Thinking about how they grow, how we use them in the environment, why we use them the way we did use them, why we're bringing them back, because of course we now have those that are resistant to Dutch elm disease. And I'll touch on Dutch elm disease in a little bit. And certainly the basic bald cypress. Why do they have those knees? What's the whole purpose of that? And we believe it has to do with oxygen use, but we don't know that for sure. That's our guess, right? One of those guesses. Why do trees lean? How do they lean? How do they stay standing up when they lean like this? So as an arborist, I'm often called to look at a tree. Does this tree pose any risk? Well, I guarantee you these trees have been leaning like this for a very long time. And I'll show you how they build wood in order to be able to accommodate for that. Thus, again, adding to that long-lived nature of the plants. These are redbuds on campus. Look how cool they are. Well, one of my favorite trees, you let them alone, they can be quite glorious and just odd structures. And they have what we call cauliflowering, which is where you see the flowers growing along the stems like that, sort of like little bursts of cauliflower, but really a nice pink color. Although I guess we do have purple cauliflower now. So some basic tree biology. This was a tree, I believe it was a willow oak at Meredith College here in Raleigh. And you could see through this large growth here. And so Bartlett Tree Care Company was maintaining this tree for a very long time. They did finally have to take it down because you really should not be able to see through the middle of a trunk of a tree and hope that it's going to be okay. All right, so essentially, what is a tree? There's lots of definitions out there. If you go on the Google, you'll see what Wikipedia might say, and it has to do with the height and the stems, how many stems do they have? And we know that crepe myrtle has more than one stem. So yeah, most trees maybe only have one stem. But to me, the bigger definition has to do with the fact that it is wood. It is wood and it is water. right? And that's the biggest parts of that system. Of course, the vascular systems are, you think back to the two main parts of that. I'm going again back to your biology days, where you have the cambium that is meristematic tissue, and that just means that it produces new cells. And on the inside, it produces phloem, which is essentially not wood. It is not part of the xylem, so it is not wood. It is actually part of the bark, and they often call it inner bark, right? And then we have xylem cells that we do indeed consider wood. So understanding that this is kind of my perspective for today, talking about wood and how do trees manage what they grow and how they grow. So just real quick, phloem, of course, is really important. We understand that it transports photosynthates and growth regulators, which are essentially hormones, which I will be talking about a little bit today. But it can be invaded by certain pathogens, phytoplasms, elm yellows, which is not necessarily an issue here, I don't believe, but Mike and I could certainly address that later. Viruses, of course, and certainly insects that will feed in that phloem area, and they can also, of course, then spread pathogens. So lots of different cool insects. So kind of keeping that in the back of your mind. I'm going to focus today mostly on xylem. So we know that xylem is made up of sapwood and heartwood. We know it conducts minerals, which is essentially the nutrients that come from the soil, right? It moves them up through the plant into the branches and back and forth all the way around that tree. So it also supports the weight of the tree. How does a redwood or a sequoia get so dang big? It's not just because of where it grows and stuff, but it has to do with how it builds those wood cells and that idea of transpiration that pulls water up through that plant. That helps in holding that tree upright, essentially. We do know they store carbohydrates. That wood is where all the carbohydrates that the plant makes in photosynthesis are stored in the cells of the tree. That's why they can live so long. It's also why they can respond well to defend themselves, but it's also why they might not die as fast as we think they should when they're damaged, right? So you plant a tree incorrectly, does it die right away? No, it usually certainly makes it through the warranty period, but how can it do that? Why do trees not die when we prune them improperly? And I always tell the master gardeners when I talk to them at my meetings about, boy, it'd be great if a tree just died if we did something wrong. And they kind of look at me like I'm a little crazy. But maybe we would stop doing incorrect pruning. Maybe we would stop putting them in poor soils and planting them incorrectly. So kind of thinking it in that way. So I mentioned here where you can get for certain pathogens in the xylem of the plant, and I'll talk about a couple of these things, but not in any great detail. I am not a plant pathologist. So we know that there's two different parts of the xylem, the sapwood and the heartwood, and the sapwood is mostly alive. All right, and it conducts. That's where all of the conducting stuff happens, where water and nutrients move throughout the plant. Not all plants form heartwood and sapwood. Some might just be solely sapwood, but many species here do have both sapwood and heartwood. I'm sure you've gone out into the woods and have seen trees, or even in urban and suburban areas, that have no internal wood. There's a column of decay or an empty hole in the middle of a tree. How is it possible that it still stands up in those cases? And so it really depends on how much sapwood do you have left? How healthy is that sapwood? So the heartwood is mostly dead, what we call apoplast. And that begins forming pretty early on, if it is going to form heartwood in the age of the tree. It's chemically altered. That means it does not necessarily conduct water and nutrients. So whatever is in there cannot be moved typically out through the rest of the plant, with one exception, the ray cells. And you guys all think about ray cells, like if you take a cookie of a tree, right? And I'll show you one in here in a second, but the ray cells radiate out like the spokes of a wheel. And so those cells are often still alive, even when the tree is very old, and can still do some conducting of materials. But for the most part, it's like whatever the tree made energy wise, like think about the bank, right? You put your money in the bank, you hope that you can get it back out. But if you hear about the depression years ago, people made a run on the banks and couldn't get their money back out. So that's kind of the way some of this works with heartwood. Note that it is not necessarily decayed wood unless something has happened inside the plant to cause that decay to occur. So I mentioned the body language of the tree, and this becomes important when we think about leaning. We think about how trees grow, and this has to do with how do they lay down wood cells. So there's two different kinds of what we call reaction wood. Reaction wood forms when a tree is wounded as well. When you prune a tree, it's an injury, right? Any injury, the plant is going to respond by forming what we call reaction wood. It's to think about the callus growth, the wound would roll over a pruning cut. So the better the pruning cut, the better that wound would roll works. But if you have an injury, say you drop a tree off of the side of a truck and it scrapes the bark off entirely and you're down to the wood. So that wound wood roll that may form there is intended to hopefully close over that wound. Doesn't necessarily always happen because it depends on the tree species, how healthy it is and so forth, how old it is. But oftentimes it's meant to strengthen that area of the plant. So I want you to picture an angiosperm like live oak, right? Where that tree can spread branches out almost horizontally. Sometimes it gets so heavy that they do touch the ground, but because of this tension wood that forms at the top of those limbs kind of holds that branch up. Conifers, in contrast, actually form what we call compression wood, and that's on the underside of the branch. So it helps hold them up. But these concepts also help explain how can a tree lean so far and not necessarily be a hazard or be a concern. Unless you start seeing on the backside, roots start puffing up and soil's displaced. That's a wholly different story. But those trees I showed you in the picture earlier, they have what we call reaction wood. And in that case was probably tension wood. Parenchyma cells, one of the key parts of plants, right? They are thin-walled, they divide and differentiate easily, they make up the cambium and other meristematic parts of the plant. I'm not going to go in any detail, but I want you to understand that they're kind of the guiding parts of the plant that tell the plant, this is what I'm going to do. This is the kind of cell you're going to be. I'm going to make you into a branch cell or a leaf cell or whatever it might be. They're super important in all of the things that happen in a plant, right? And so often they are the target of many pathogens because, hey, they're everywhere. And that's a cool and easy way to get inside the plant. So when we talk about, I've mentioned the difference between conifers and angiosperms. What I simply want you to know is that gymnosperms have these little cells called tracheids, and that's kind of why they say that they're soft-wooded, just often softer wooded than, say, an angiosperm like an oak, but a lot of genetic variation there. So that's just a general idea. So they all conduct water and nutrients, and they provide mechanical support. Again, many of these are dead. Okay, just kind of keeping in mind. Most of the cells in a mature tree are dead. So you have, in maybe some species, you might have 10 to 20 or so live growth rings that are sapwood, that are still living cells for the most part. But most of them are dead. Doesn't mean that they're not, supporting the tree, because that's exactly what they're doing. So they also have fibers as well as parenchyma cells. Okay, so then angiosperms you see have fibers. They also have tracheids and parenchyma cells, but they have something else called a vessel element. Notice how big in diameter those vessel elements are. And so the cool thing about them is, if you imagine, it makes more sense that these are much more efficient in moving water up and down through the trees. And this helps explain why conifers and angiosperms grow differently, how they adapt, how they manage diseases, and so forth. So some of these vessel elements can be over 50 feet long. They can be as long as the trunk of a tree, the whole stem of a tree. That's pretty cool when you start to think about a tree that's 100 feet tall. You have one of these little vessel elements that can be 50 or more feet long. So they're strengthened by something called lignin. We talk about lignin. I'm going to go into detail of that, but lignin and cellulose and hemicellulose are all those things that help hold plants together, so to speak. And when you get the presentation, you'll see I have some information in the notes that go into a little bit more detail there, and I'll make sure that's shared with y'all. I want to share with you too this idea of how wood is laid down, because it certainly affects how plants can manage stress. So we have two different types of wood. These are growth increments, they call them. They don't really call them growth rings anymore, but you can see what we call ring porous has a lot of bigger of these vessels right close to that, what we call springwood, the new growth in the spring. Of course, that slows down in the summer, both species, but both types of plants. You have diffuse pores where they're spread out more throughout the plant, right? Yeah, you have a few maybe more right at that growth increment, but for the most part, they're spread out through that entire growth increment. So notice the species for ring porous plants: oak, elm, ash, chestnut. So if you know anything about some of these species, there are diseases that are spread through the vascular system, and things like oak wilt, ash, so kind of microplasms, ash yellows, elm, certainly Dutch elm disease, chestnut blight. So while they are spread by insects, typically they move throughout those systems through these vascular pores. And if you imagine, remember what I just said about a 50-foot long vessel? Well, it's like a superhighway. So you can see how that can spread through the tree much more quickly than in other cases. So just an example of a couple species where you have a difference in conifers, which have very few fibers and stuff that are visible because they're so small. So kind of what does it all mean? Again, it go back to the thing I kind of mentioned at first. Trees live longer and have the ability to get much bigger than other plants. They respond to diseases and insects and environmental stressors typically successfully. And if you look at the history, how long do trees live? We're talking trees that can live hundreds. If not, there's some examples of bristlecone pine that can live over 5,000 years, which is remarkable. There's some yews that in the UK that are 5,000 or more years old. So they can certainly live very long time. That's not typically what we have in our landscapes. We have plants that grow maybe to 100 or 300 years in some cases, but that's rare. Right. But if we can get 100 or so, that's pretty cool. When we think about many of our oaks, certainly live oak can live quite a long period of time. And so they're putting a lot of energy investment into that wood, right, into what they have. So they can tap into some of that over time as they have issues, right? What do I need to put my energy in today? Is it reproduction? Is it defending myself? Has somebody come in and pruned the heck out of me? Now I have to deal with wound closure. So all of those things. So again, incredibly resilient. But as I said, they have to allocate that energy to a lot of different functions. And that's why it takes so long sometimes for a plant that we think should die to actually die, because of that stored energy that they're able to tap into. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And that's what makes diagnosis of tree issues somewhat more challenging, because where do you track it back to? Is it back to when it was planted incorrectly or when it was pruned incorrectly? Because for the most part, a tree that's pruned incorrectly does not typically die, not even shrubs, because if that was the case, there'd be a lot of dead trees around, as you guys well know. So which of these functions, I just want you guys to guess, which of these functions do you think might cost the most for the plant? And so I'll tell you, it's actually defense, because they have to form these complex compounds of like phenols, it's things I probably can't even pronounce, anthraquinones, cyanogetic glyphosides, benzophenones, again and again. So all these phenolic compounds that are not necessarily there all the time, that they have to manufacture in order to defend themselves from disease, insects, and humans, of course. And of course, we talk about those environmental stresses. A lot of environmental stresses, of course, are caused by humans, as we well know. So what happens in the tree when you have this kind of physiological response? What happens in the tree? And I want you to look at it in a different way, because this is something that we can think about. How does this apply to our landscapes and our management of trees in urban environments? And so somebody came up with this little framework, and you don't need to read all of that stuff right now. What I want you to get are the three main factors. We have predisposing factors, inciting factors, and then contributing factors. And so you see we have human, category for humans, which is saying a lot longer than the category for biophysical, or what happens with the plant itself, right? Or the environment. So predisposing factors are things like just normal human and site-related conditions. Where the heck are you planting that tree? Why are you planting it there? What's the reason? And so forth. Inciting factors means, are there some kind of short-term stressors that can impact vigor of the plant? So you planted it in a 4x4 cutout in the sidewalk. That is certainly an inciting factor. You were made to do that because the human predisposing factor said you must plant trees along the street. Okay. And then contributing factors are things like other issues that might happen. Maybe there's a disturbance. Maybe the soil is bad. Maybe there's some other issue. It's the inappropriate species for that contributes to the loss of that tree. And so what ends up happening is you may have to remove that plant because of the possible risk, or it may just die in place because of all of the other things kind of happening there. So that's kind of what we see is this idea of this, how do trees in the urban environment actually die, and why do they die? Why do they become a risk over time, right? Some risks we can certainly avoid better than we have been. So I want you to look at it this way, what we call the tree mortality spiral. And Mike Munster probably recognizes this because we talked about this at the Extension Conference. I don't remember if it was last year or the year before, but doesn't matter. But so I'm going to give you a scenario. We have a healthy red maple on the left and a mature willow oak on the right. All right. So the first predisposing factor for the red maple is that you're required to plant a tree there. Okay. The second inciting factor is the pressure to plant a native species. And then the contributing factor is the selection of that inappropriate species. Why is it inappropriate? Well, because you're planting this healthy red maple into a tree pit. And what you see happens is as you go around, you plant it in this tree pit, right? If you irrigate and possibly manage nutrients, that tree can still survive and do okay. You might have to impose an intensive health care program for that tree. You have to factor in those root limitations. Maybe there's a plant growth regulator or continued irrigation that can take it off of that mortality spiral. But say you don't do any of those things. Now you're spiraling around where, again, not in the best site. Even though it's a native tree, it's not a urban native tree. You end up with gloomy scale. And so that leads to tree decline. So you get chlorosis and dieback. Again, maybe you can pull it out. You could certainly treat for gloomy scale. You can do a tree assessment. And if it's possible, again, treatment. But if not, then the tree's going to end up being either needing to be removed or it will die on its own, essentially. So that is a very commonly planted tree here in Raleigh. Willow oak is certainly another tree that had been planted quite extensively. So it's kind of many of the same factors are imposed in here, but we're talking now about an 80-year-old tree. So that's been in the tree lawn a long time, right? Tree lawn, tree cutout, but tree lawn's a little bit better site. So you might have to do some pruning on it because it's big, right? It's got dieback. It's 80 years old, for crying out loud, right? So then we have drought, we have high heat. All of those things, we do a risk assessment and it says, are we going to mitigate that risk again, which means do we need to do more pruning? What happens with trees is they do what we call retrenchment, and I'll talk about that in just one second. And they continue to decline. Can you do safety pruning to take the dead out? Absolutely. Do many communities have the money to do that? Absolutely not. So then that plant develops weeping conch. All right, Pseudoeninotus is the genus of that. So again, that dry heat, the high heat, the poor conditions all kind of contribute to this plant. Weeping conch, it can certainly happen, and it typically happens when those trees are in their 80s or so. And it's not an if question, it's a when question, whether it needs to be removed or not. So you do another risk assessment. If you have a lot of weeping conch fruiting bodies, then most likely it's going to have to be removed. So just kind of think through that. And again, I have that kind of written in the notes here to talk about what that happens. So retrenchment is a natural occurring thing. I am in my 60s and I'm just getting shorter. It's not right at all. Gravity's taken over things and I don't like it. But it happens to trees in a slightly different way, but it's the same sort of theory. It's retrenchment. So what they're doing is they're pulling in their canopy. And so that means you're going to have some dieback on the outer edges of those canopies you see in both of these pictures, right? And those are birds in the trees, not some weird growth. How well you can see that. And so the internal part of the can be quite good and healthy, but you'll see where you're starting to get this dieback. Typically, also the trunk will increase in girth, although not necessarily significantly, because if you have an 80-year-old oak, it may be 60 inches in diameter already. So it's not going to get a significant increase in girth, but that's essentially what's happening. So it's trying to pull back its resources. Remember, I told you what that plant has to do with its resources. So it's trying to pull them all back so that it can manage them better. And right, what do we use those things for? So when you may get calls about this. Why is my tree declining? And I'm seeing a lot of this. What contributes to retrenchment? Certainly many of those things I've talked about already, and we'll talk about a few more in a couple of minutes. But so kind of what happens in the plant when it is stressed, right? All kinds of things are altered now, right? The plant physiology is altered. Cells start to break down, and then tissues break down. So now we're talking a more expansive breakdown of the plant itself. You have thinner or weaker cells. They get leaky, right? Stuff is starting to leak out. It's not going where it needs to go or being stored where it needs to go. When you start getting the breakdown of cellulose and lignin over time, remember, all of these things take a lot of time. That's why we don't often see trees die of stress immediately. You might have lesions or cankers that form. This could be an injury that's, again, the plant closed it over. Remember what I mentioned about reaction wood? That's what this is right here, where you've got that roll over. The younger and healthier trees, the better that's going to respond. Once it gets older, not necessarily going to work. Now, I also have a picture here of a tree that was planted pretty young, planted incorrectly, also had probably some sort of injury along the trunk. You can see that's really looking like good soil there, right? So it is winter, so this is a warm season turf, so it shouldn't be green at this point. But many factors contributed to this, and I bet if we looked at the top of that tree, there would still be some live branches there. So it does take that long period of time for plants to die. Certainly, interactions happen inside the plant. We've already mentioned kind of the chemistry and the hormones and what genetics of the plant fit into that. What species are they? This happens to be a Cornus florida, a flowering dogwood planted in full sun, in terrible soil, in competition with grass, and planted too high. The staking we won't even worry about because that's just sad, but it's not going to harm the tree. But it was never irrigated. So all of those things are things that could have been avoided that have not been. And one of the things you'll hear me talk about is soil, right? Not compost, not organic matter, but soil. How do we manage healthy soils? So also a factor in what is the degree of stress? When does it happen in the plant's life? Are there other things that may help the plant adapt or not, right? So kind of fitting all of those things together to say what can happen. And actually, this is not going to be the end of this plant's life. It probably rained and the plant probably came back fine. But why do we put them in that stress situation to start with? Trees have a long memory. I say that, but kind of tongue in cheek because I don't think they have brains like we do. I don't know though, right? That's one of those things we don't know. But my point being is they manage things different ways, but they remember things that have happened. And here's a prime example of that. One of these giant sequoias that evolved with fire. And so fire is an important part of that ecosystem. And that's true of many ecosystems in the world. But the big but here is that these fires are changing. And so this is a picture also from Sequoia National Park, where this was the top of the hill. So these are mostly pines, but they've had such intense fires. And I think it was back in 2021 where they had a huge fire that took out many of the giant sequoias, and there aren't that many left. So all of these trees have evolved with that fire, which just makes it so amazing. And I want you to look here at this picture on the left, see that kind of thick part here that lies underneath this bark here. But that's what allows that tree to continue to stand up and continue to produce enough food and move water and nutrients through the plant enough to have that hang on. But the intensity of fires are changing. The frequency of fires are changing. And so those things are factored in because when plants adapt, it's over the long haul, right? As I mentioned earlier, not the short. And so we're going to see more plants dying and more trees in our natural areas. So how else do they respond? I mentioned hormones and chemistry, plant growth regulators. They are certainly used as a tool in the arboriculture industry. A lot of people, I understand, don't care for them, but they can be used to reduce the amount of pruning that needs to be done under utility lines. And you can see actually because you're applying essentially, in some cases, hormones or anti-gibberellins, because gibberellins, of course, are involved in cell elongation. You can make the plant actually more drought tolerant because you get thicker leaves with more chlorophyll in them. And there's a bunch of studies that have been done on growth regulators that actually have shown a lot of good information about how to use a growth regulator as a tool. And so even in landscape management, how can we use them for hedge control, right? Instead of having to prune them so often. So it becomes an economic tool as well. So a few of the main hormones, abscisic acid, of course, that controls the opening and closure of stomata, which is pretty important. So if the soil's dry, the plant signals, the ABA signals the leaves to close down some stomata. Obviously, they can't do that forever, and nor do they shut all of them down, or that would be a problem for the plant. Plants control, auxin controls tropism. Of course, we use that as a tool for root growth, but apical dominance means, do we have a single main stem? If you have trees that have lost their terminal, then they've lost apical dominance. And so how do you maintain them in the landscape in that way? Cytokinins, of course, cell division, ethylene is ripening, and leaf abscission. So abscisic acid is not actually the primary player in leaf abscission. It is actually ethylene. So you might have heard of this term coated, which is the compartmentalization of decay, and sometimes they've changed it to mean disease as what, decay and damage in trees. It's not disease. Wood decay is not disease, but it certainly can lead to stress. But I want you to see, it's essentially, the idea of coated is there's these four walls, like you put yourself in your room right now, you have a ceiling and a floor, you have a wall, an interior wall and an exterior wall. And so the plant has the ability to wall off any damage that happens to it or any decay that happens to it, as you can see here. And how they build those walls is really important. All of the hormones, for the most part, that I've mentioned are super important in how this happens. So a healthy tree is going to be able to produce enough hormones to allow the plant to close over some of these issues, right? And again, that's why you may often see an internal column of decay in there, because this idea of compartmentalization has actually done what it's supposed to. So ethylene is essentially a stress hormone, and it initiates that first like, oh my gosh, I've been wounded. What's going to happen? These parenchyma cells then start to shift what they're doing and form phenols and terpenes and stuff. And even these little things we call tyloses to plug up cells. So things are going to move around there. So microorganisms cannot easily be spread through the cells. Auxin actually regulates cell elongation. So and tissue repair. So they're really important in forming this wall 4 that you see in this picture, which is formed right after the injury, and it walls off from the things coming in from the outside. All right, abscisic acid, as I already mentioned. I say that fast 3 times. Abscisic acid, of course, really important in allowing and allocating carbohydrates and starch to be stored in kind of those defensive barrier zones as well. So I won't dwell on that a lot, but I want you to understand, how does a tree respond when it is injured? And this is true if it is wounded by pruning. So what else if you have water stress, which is a perfect topic for right now, right? We're way behind. What happens in a plant? Of course, the initial thing is the plant wilts, and then that actually it maybe recovers. Depends on the soil water content. Of course, trees have much broader, wider root systems and can actually do what we call hydraulic lift and sometimes pull water from lower levels of the soil up to the surface, which can benefit other plants in that understory. But you still may have a reduction in growth and yield. You may get leaf scorch. That can happen right away, and we've certainly seen that already this year. You will, if the drought continues, you'll get leaf, twig, and branch dieback. The following year, you might see a reduction in leaf area. Maybe those leaves are smaller than on average, smaller than they usually are, and often noticeably. You may also make it more susceptible to stressors and diseases later. Phytophthora root rot is one of those where during the drought, the plant is stressed. The following year, now you get rain and that Phytophthora can become active and kill the plants. So again, plant death may take a very long period of time. Water stress, we call it instead of drought, like drought and flooding are meteorological terms, right? Water stress is what we talk about when we talk about what's happening in the plant. So it's not drought stress, it's water stress brought on either by drought or in this case by flooding. And so similar things happen. You think about some plants can tolerate this kind of flooding for days, some can tolerate it for weeks, some cannot tolerate it at all. And so the flooding can certainly kill the plants. And again, it may not happen for many years until you start seeing things going south. And in interest of time, I'm going to just not worry about talking about all of these things, but you can imagine what can happen there. Drowning trees, again, is it acute? Do you have soil changes? And oftentimes you do. There's a lot of times water brings in chemistry and other chemicals and sediment from other locations. They can certainly knock over trees by scouring the soil, and it can lead to chronic problems. Also, of course, we know that when you have a lot of rain in a short period of time, it destabilizes the relationship between the roots and the soil. And so I have seen, sadly, trees just fall over. Of course, along the bank of a river, that's certainly obvious, but in this case where you have a tree in the landscape that falls over, and that's scary, and that does happen. And sometimes the problem is it doesn't happen right away. It happens maybe weeks or a month later. So the guiding principles of tree growth management is what we call this arboriculture, right? Is understanding that trees can grow rapidly. Obviously, I understand that every species grows at its own rate, and it all depends on the conditions that plant is put in. Is it the right soil? Is it even soil, or is it subsoil that we've planted in, which is the case with many new developments, of course. They don't bring in topsoil. And so we are trying to grow trees in a nutrient poor system and expect them to grow. And sadly, they actually do grow and they often live, but they will never be what they could have been. For example, Poulin Park, Poulin Road, they planted a bunch of willow oak over the years up near the Catholic Church. And they ended up with a lot of trunk sprouts, adventitious roots, showing that those trees are stressed. They have gone in and pruned them off, but those trees will never be 80 years old. They might be, but they'll never be 80 feet tall. They'll never be what they could have been if they had been put into a really good soil situation. So because they have a long lifespan, and I mentioned this sort of before, they thrive in stable conditions. And when we think about stable, we have to think about the lifespan of trees. As I said, these long-lived trees, redwoods, whatever it might be in our forests, our live oaks. You think of southern, landscapes with live oak everywhere that live hundreds of years. How does that happen? Well, it's stable conditions over a long period of time. So we have to think about how do we do management of those plants, because it has to be long term. And that's where we often fall short, is that once the tree gets old, we're like, it's all good, we're done. But the issue is that you can do pretty good, heavier management when the tree is younger and more tolerant of that. And then as time goes by, that system has to change where you're not cutting off live wood anymore. Because again, going back to everything I've talked about today, how do you think a plant would respond if we've wounded it over and over again? And now it's losing those stored resources and they're unavailable because they're in the heartwood of the tree. That how is it going to be able to manage all of the things it has to do and still be able to manage that defense part of it? So we want to really minimize the amount of pruning that we do as trees get older. And that's, of course, pruning is a whole different conversation, but that is a huge part of arboriculture, of what we need to do with trees. So when they're older, we should be taking no more than 10% of that canopy off when we do pruning, if at all necessary, right? So we want to be really thoughtful in removing live wood material, particularly from, I would say, middle age and on. So again, kind of thinking, what does it all mean? It means selecting the right tree. This is a great place for red maple. This is an awesome place, right? There's a road there, but it's pretty far away and it has a huge open root system. There's not a lot of reflected heat. It's not in a downtown planting area. So red maple is an awesome tree in the right location. So a young tree like this, again, ignore the staking. It's very hard to find plant pictures of trees that are staked well. I guess I have to take them myself. But this is a honey locust, so this is what it's meant to look like. Even still, it has one main leader that kind of goes up through the top, and then everything else kind of comes off of that. So when a tree is young, this is when we prune it. This is when we manage it for good structure, because we know, again, long lifespan, different intensity of care from the time it's young and on. So you all know right plant, right plant, right place. So that, but sometimes you're stuck with whatever place you have and whatever weather conditions you have. So you have to be much more thoughtful in then what do you actually plant in those locations. Again, managing trees when they're older takes money, a lot of money, because oftentimes you're going to have people climb. You notice where I showed you the pictures of retrenchment, where that dieback is. So it is tricky to get a climber out to the ends of those branches. It can be done, but it takes really skilled workers, or you have to have a bucket truck or a crane or some kind of lift to be able to get to removing those outer branches. And what I see mostly are people are not doing good management of older trees because they've let them go because they think, they're okay, they're all good, right? They're alive and they're healthy, they think. But I've gotten a lot of pictures over the past few years of large trees declining. Some of that is certainly retrenchment. Some of it has to do with soil compaction. But it's often a suite of issues. It's not often just one thing that we can point our finger and say, hey, that's it. And I know Mike and Matt get tons of photos like that. A lot of it is educational guesses. Again, because what do we know and what can we put together? And oftentimes, of course, it's hard to put stuff together from a picture. This is a sawtooth oak that is planted at the Brickyard. I think they're going to stay. I don't know. They're doing a boatload of construction there. But these wounds, I took this picture when I started here in 2007. So that cool little belly button, that's awesome. That's when you know you made a good cut. Now you can't even see them. Are they still there? Absolutely. So if they were a bad cut, they'd still be there, but they might not have been closed over quite as well. So then that allows entry of disease organisms. Again, all of these things add together to affect the long-term health of that plant. So kind of finishing up here, how do we prepare for the unknown? Again, picking the right plant and even down to the right cultivar of plants, planting it correctly, and don't overuse what works. This is the problem I see everywhere, right? We overplanted willow oak in the Piedmont here. We overplanted red maple. We overplanted crepe myrtle. We've overplanted many things. That's what happened years ago when we overplanted ash. We overplanted elm. So all of those things, we still have not learned from that mistake where we continue to do much of the same thing. We got to stop that cycle and increase the biodiversity of what we're putting in our landscapes. I don't mean one street can't be all one species, because that would make a landscape architect crazy if you tried to mix it all up. I like it myself, but that's just me. But I just mean that in a community, you have to make sure that you have a good diversity. When you think about pollinators, what is it about? It's about diversity, right? So this is just diversity on a much larger scale. So treating them and maintaining them properly, training them early, because a lot of the research has shown is if you do not, when you have these weather events, there's much more significant damage if a tree has not been trained or pruned well. Also, of course, if we aren't maintaining them properly, then you're going to end up having greater issues with biotic issues, right? Insects and disease coming forth. And so finally, I want you all to remember who really saved the day. This is Samwise Gamgee. If you ever watched the Lord of the Rings movie, he's the gardener, and he really saved the day. It was not Frodo. So I'll say that tongue in cheek, but gardeners can save the day, and I think we want to keep that in mind. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions, or if you have comments or thoughts, please do so. And if you want me to stop sharing, I can do that.
That was excellent, Barb. We do have a few questions that came in the chat. I'll read them out if we can go through them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you were talking about branches that die, so dead branches in trees. Is it beneficial to trim those out, or should you just leave them and let the tree take care of them naturally?
No, you need to, here's the best way to look at it is looking at it as where is that tree located? If it is in an urban or suburban environment, then it poses a risk. So everybody wants to have no risk, right? Risk-free. If you want to have a risk-free landscape, you cannot have a tree. That's just the bottom line of it. Every tree poses some level of risk. And so it's not as bad as everybody, oh my gosh, yeah, what does that mean? It's not as bad. When I do risk assessments, it's not as bad as people think it's going to be oftentimes. But you can't have branches that are over 2 inches diameter on a tree that are dead. Why? Because if it's a 80-foot tall tree and it falls and somebody's under there, it will kill you. So not to be scary, but that's just the kind of general guideline we go by. If you've got branches that are 2 inches in diameter that are dead, they need to come out of the tree. And so you do need to do some of that pruning. And it is not inexpensive by any means if anybody's had tree work done, especially if you need to have a climber, a bucket truck, a crane, or whatever come in. So yeah, if it poses a risk, yes. If it's out in the middle of the field, no, then you don't need to worry about it. It is taking care of itself in a sense by allowing that to happen. And eventually it will die, but it could be 20, 30, 50 years down the line.
Excellent. Okay, here's a great question. How are trees affected by the products we put on our lawns, the trees that are
Oh,
growing in the lawn?
right. That is a good question. So it really depends on the products, right? So if you're fertilizing your turf, then you don't need to fertilize your trees by any means because trees use far less, particularly nitrogen, than turf grass does. So trees and turf don't dig each other. They're not really good buddies. Let's just say that, right? So the tree provides too much shade for people that want a really nice turf under there. So that's why we always recommend put mulch under there and other plants that like shade. You kind of have to do that when they're small so you aren't trying to dig into the roots of the tree. It's very challenging to do that. But again, for most products, like a lot of weed and feed products, they don't necessarily affect the trees negatively if they are applied correctly. So that's the key. Know what's being put on the landscape. And that's the problem when you guys work with clients, homeowners, they aren't going to always know what's being put down on their landscapes. And that's the struggle. We just need to encourage them to ask their landscaper or their lawn care maintenance company, give me a list of what you're putting down so that if something were to happen, you would understand that. And I think Dr. Neal would agree with me to say that a lot of times people think herbicides cause damage, and they certainly can, but only when they're applied incorrectly, typically, will they cause damage to trees, and often it's temporary.
All right, we have time for one more question. Another one that's very appropriate for the current weather situation is, so if we're looking at drought, we're currently in drought, drought's likely to continue. Should I water a 190-year-old white oak?
Oh, that is a great question. I'm going to answer one I just saw pop up, though, about fertilization. Yes, if you're going to fertilize a tree, it needs to be below the turf grass. It needs to be below. So a lot of arborists will use soil injections, and they're also applying a very different kind of fertilizer, super low in nitrogen. I mean, below 1% in nitrogen. So that's the answer to that question. Yes, it is important. And I've gotten quite a few calls and questions lately about watering large mature trees. You think it this way, years ago in Texas, they had a 5-year-long drought. Millions of trees died. There, you just can't, plants cannot live without water. I mean, they can go a long time, but they can't live without it. And there will be repercussions. You will have dieback. But if you put a soaker hose out under a tree, let's say you have a 30-foot wide canopy. That's where your drip line is. You're going to put it in concentric rings underneath that tree, and you're going to be watering that tree for about 6 hours. And I know that because I just did the calculation for somebody on a 30-foot wide drip line. So obviously, keeping it in that area, and that's going to allow that water to get down in there. The cool thing is you don't have to do it all the time. You do it once. And of course, now we're getting some rain, so that's good. As long as if it's not raining for months, you've got to irrigate. I mean, that's just if it's a significant tree and you don't want any dieback, then you gotta irrigate.
Fantastic. Well, you can see there's lots of compliments coming into the chat, and that was such an excellent presentation. Thank you for fitting so much fantastic and in-depth information and relevant and practical just into just a great engaging presentation. So there's a few more questions we didn't get to. You're welcome to reply to in the chat if you're able to hang around.
Sure, I'll do that.
All right, excellent. So I think for now, though, we'll pass it over to Matt and Mike. So if you want to stop your share, they'll be able to share screen and talk about BOLOs. Those are the Be on the Lookout pests and plant diseases for the coming months.
All right. Well, I'm going to talk about some arthropod bolos for late May, early June. Unfortunately, there's too many critters out now. I've been seeing a lot of things out. I was at the botanical gardens last week for a symposium and saw all different stuff out. In fact, the viburnums had all these insects all over the flowers, which some of the viburnums were just kind of seizing the flowers. They were starting to turn to fruit. But anyway, lots of stuff coming out, lots of stuff active. Right now, for instance, is when you might be wanting to look for bagworms, the small bagworms that are more susceptible to pesticides and whatnot. So I like to show this picture. We got in this twig of an arborvitae, and there were 30 little baby bagworms on this little tiny piece of the plant. So they may be deceptive. They're very tiny and covered in the bag and camouflage in with the host. So this is when to look for those young caterpillars that are going to start to get bigger and feed on the plants. But you're also going to see lots of other caterpillars. For instance, the fall webworms, which are typically kind of a summer species that we see more stuff in the summer. We're going to start to see the young bags, the little tents they form, these little tiny kind of hatchling or young caterpillars starting to create webbing in some plants. So those can be pruned out if you find them. That can relieve the tree of the infestation and be on the lookout for them. And I saw lots of different caterpillars, lots of different things feeding last week. So things are out and about. As long as the caterpillars, you're going to be seeing some sawflies out and about feeding on plants, very similar to the caterpillars, but have 6 or more pairs of prolegs, those fleshy legs on the abdomen, and they have a single eye lens on the head. Often feeding in groups, but you may start to see the pine sawflies, the broadleaf feeding sawflies. This one feeding on elm, but lots of different species feeding on lots of different plants. Everybody's favorite beetle, the Japanese beetle, is going to become active soon. The larvae have finished their development over the spring. They're going to pupate and they're going to start to emerge, and you're going to start to see them on your plants. They seem to love grapes and roses, but feed on lots of different plants. I've seen different species fed upon by the adults. They're going to skeletonize the leaves, feed on things. Definitely take a look on how to control them, but don't use the beetle bags because that'll just attract them to your yard. But anyway, Japanese beetles are going to start to become active soon. We're also going to see a lot of bugs becoming active. So a lot of the lace bugs are breeding and developing on the plants. You're going to see garden flea hoppers all over. Although again, all these bolos depend on your region you're in. So if you're in the east, you're probably seeing these things come out earlier. The people in the mountains are going to see these things later as the temperature, the weather warms up. You guys see now the carpenter bees have kind of been doing a lot of their activity. We're going to start to maybe see tiger bee flies. So this is a species of bee fly that is very large. You can see this next to a carpenter bee hole. This one has just emerged. And so these are good guys, especially if you don't like carpenter bees attacking your house and stuff. So don't swat these things and let them do their thing. As far as protecting plants is great, but also protecting yourself. So this is the time where we're going to see mosquitoes and ticks abundantly. And so wear protection when you're out for ticks. Try to mow down some trails or some areas, patches that don't have the long grass. That's where they're going to climb up onto quest, which means they put out their front legs and smell the CO2, and then they grab passersby to feed on them. And of course, making sure you can get rid of the small bits of water containers around your yard, around the neighborhood will keep the breeding sites for mosquitoes down. If you have a bird bath or something you want to keep wet, you can sometimes treat them with some BT dunks or things that will kill the mosquito larvae in them. And of course, there's too much to talk about, like I said. So this is the active time of year. Just about all the critters are out there and active. All the flowers are starting to flower. The plants are growing and they're becoming good food for the insects. So you never know what you're going to see out there. It's going to be based often on what you plant out in the site, what you're going to attract and what's going to feed on it, because every different plant has its different suite of pests and beneficials and whatnot. So just to let you know, here are some tephritid fruit flies mating, and they will lay their eggs in the flower heads, and their maggots live in the flower heads and feed on them. This is a pecan carpenter worm, which its larvae bore into pecans and some other hardwoods. You've got this longhorn that will girdle echinacea and rudbeckia and lay its eggs in there to bore into the stems. And this is a little carpenter bee that uses pits of plants, but is a good pollinator as well. And just finally, before I give it over to Mike, I've got a couple of specific bolos. First, anybody recognize this thing? I don't have an official quiz here, but you may recognize it. I was finally able to get photos of this little critter. Somebody brought them to me, and this is the baby, the very young spotted lanternfly. And so be on the lookout for them. Right now, we're going to be seeing the little dominoes, and soon enough, within the next month or so, we're going to start to see the oldest nymphs that are red begin to develop, and then from them, we'll develop the adults. So we're going to probably look at another month or two before we start seeing a lot of the adults out there. Let's see. One thing to be on the lookout for, of course, is the yellow-legged hornet. This is Vespa velutina. It is a true hornet native to Asia, first found in Georgia near Savannah in 2023. Last year, a nest was found in South Carolina outside of Charlotte, right over the border. So we are concerned that it is establishing, and we're going to not really know until this year when we see what they're finding out there. But this is a true hornet, but not the murder hornet in quotes. These are a bit smaller. They make an embryo nest before making another larger nest around it, and then they create a large paper nest, a secondary nest out on trees like our native bald-faced hornets. And at the peak of their activity, they can have 400 to 2,000 workers in that nest. They're not necessarily more of a risk to humans than kind of bald-faced hornets and other kind of large wasps. They're mostly going to be a risk, and what we're concerned about is that they attack bees and other flying insects and may even hover around and invade beehives and kill the bees there. So beekeepers are a bit more concerned about these hornets, but be on the lookout for them. Here's what the embryo nest looks like, and then a primary nest built around it. And these are courtesy of the Georgia Department of Agriculture. And then a large nest up in a tree. It's going to be typically a little bit more brown than the gray nests of bald-faced hornets. But anyway, if you spot one of these, especially if you can get some binoculars, see these wasps, you're kind of confirming it. Definitely let us or the North Carolina Department of Agriculture know because we need to find them as soon as possible. And just to take a look, you can visit this site. I'll copy the link into the chat afterward for some of the comparisons, but they're medium size, about a 1 inch, a little over 1 inch long, and they can be very dark in color, mostly, except for the pale legs or the feet, the tarsi, and then the tip of the abdomen is lighter yellow or orange compared to the base of the abdomen and the thorax. And so we're on the lookout for these, of course. And finally, always be on the lookout for box tree moth. If you have a boxwood and you start to see caterpillars, especially these green caterpillars with black spots and a black head, or any of these moths with this gray border and this white triangle in the center, anything like that on your boxwoods, please let us know, or North Carolina Department of Ag immediately, because this is a very destructive pest of boxwoods. And with that, I think I'm done. I'm going to stop sharing and answer some questions.
While he's reading his questions, I saw that someone asked about how you differentiate the yellow-legged hornet. And speaking from personal experience, I can say as a pathologist, not entomologist, don't just go by it has yellow legs, because it's not the only thing out there that has yellow legs. It's more subtle than that.
Yes, that is true. Yes, and be very careful. I put a link in the chat, but be very careful to look at those very specific characteristics. I always get a lot of messages. I just got one today with European hornet. People think it's an invasive one. It has been here for a long time, and it's very distinct once you know what to look for, but be very careful to look specifically at those things that are pointed out on those web pages.
I will shift into third gear here and take away with a few disease bolos for your late May to late June time period. And I wanted to start off, this was actually not going to be originally part of my presentation, but after Barb was talking about the effects of drought as a predisposing, or I'm not sure if she had the predisposing or the inciting area, but this is definitely a predisposing factor for a certain disease, although I'm not sure that it really needs drought to be affected arborvitaes. But I use this as an example of armillaria root rot, which is something to be on the lookout for. Notice that they had already lost a tree here and replanted it, and then another one went down in the line. And we got that sample in and looked under the bark, where there was the clear evidence of the mycelial mat there between the bark and the wood of armillaria. And this is one I'm a little concerned that we might see more of, an uptick in the coming months and even into next year, or who knows how long, based on the fact that we have had this drought that we've been in. I wanted to include also a be on the lookout that I haven't mentioned before, and in part because it really wasn't quite at our doorstep yet, but then suddenly it wasn't on the doorstep, it was in the house. And that was, or is, beech leaf disease. This was first found in the US in 2012 in Ohio, caused by, of all things, a leaf infesting nematode called Lytolenchus crenati mccannii. And in North Carolina, it's a very interesting story we don't have time to go into, but the first case was confirmed in North Carolina in August 2025 in the Boone area, and more cases were found actually this month in that same area. So what are you looking for so that we can be on the lookout? Well, the main thing would be these, I want to call them galls, but these bands here in the leaf of the beech, yellow often, but very often they're dark if you look at them with the light from behind. So that's a good thing to look for, since there are some other things that will cause some yellowing I'll mention in a moment. They also can cause some leaf distortion, and it can be a serious disease causing defoliation and weakening of trees and even tree death. Here is a picture of a look-alike. This is damage caused by the feeding of woolly aphids in the genus Philaphus, and we can drop the URL also in the resources page, but that's the QR code to go to a page that Ohio State did about comparing these two. One of the key differences being, notice how the leaf edges are rolled down and when you have feeding by the aphids. So this is very common in the state. So don't immediately panic if you see yellow banding on the leaves of your beech, but do be on the lookout. All right, last month I mentioned rose rosette, but I didn't include this slide. So just really quickly, of course, you're going to be looking this time of year. I saw some just the other day, those elongating shoots that stay red instead of turning green as an early sign, but a couple later signs that if you see these, you know you've got rose rosette would be the hyperthorniness on the left there, or this one where you see that a branch is thicker than the cane that it developed from. So when you see that, that's another clear indication you've got rose rosette. Here's a little story. This is from quite a few years ago now, but a landscape at a golf course where they were on a monthly fungicide program. Of course, we're hoping that they would be ahead of things, but yet they had this big problem, and it turned out to be not a fungus at all, but root knot nematodes. So don't forget that down below in the soil, there may be some things going on either to our advantage or in this case, disadvantage. And here's a picture from this is actually a cucumber root system here with the very large galls on it. We can see all different categories of plants. I didn't mention turf, but they can also get root knot nematode. But here, woody plants are especially, we see them on boxwoods and gardenias and figs, but there are others. Flowering plants like liriope, begonia impatiens, those two really get hit hard by root knot nematode. And in the vegetable garden, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, cucurbits, beans, beets, spinach, okra, so quite a few things there. The galls may be large, as you see there on the impatiens, or you would see on tomato, for example, but on other hosts like boxwood and here on liriope, I have to draw the circle there, so that's actually quite small, and they're smaller than even the storage swellings in the roots of these plants naturally. So just because you see a swelling, you have to be careful, do I have or not have a root knot nematode problem? No, again, know the healthy plant. What can you do about root knot nematodes? There are several publications out there. I just mentioned these two, one called Management of Root Knot Nematodes in Bedding Plants from NC State Extension, and another called Control of Root Knot Nematodes in the Home Vegetable Garden. And we'll have these available in the resources as well. powdery versus downy mildew. So powdery mildew, of course, we see all the time, every year, on many different plants. Downy mildew, even though it has a similar name, has very different symptoms. So on cucumber, it starts out with these bright yellow, very angular spots. On squash, it may be more necrotic and less angular, but it's a very different organism, and it's one that doesn't survive the winter in North Carolina. So each year we wait, and sometime, usually early June, can vary a couple of weeks either side of that, the downy mildew of cucurbits shows up, and so be on the lookout for that, as well as powdery mildew, which we'll see in many different forms. Could be the big powdery patches like with the euonymus here on the left, or it might be subtler, maybe just kind of almost a drought stress looking aspect to a leaf where you have to hold it up to the light at an angle and say, ah, yeah, there's some powdery mildew on there. Dogwood is what I'm talking about, of course, where you may actually have a hard time seeing at certain stages the development of the fungus itself. Rusts, what we typically consider quince rust on calorie pear, and this affects the fruits. This time of year we'd be seeing this, and stem infections as well. Just about a week ago or so, I collected a bunch of fruits off of our flowering quince in the backyard, and they were just covered with one of these gymnosporangium rust fungi. So that is something it's to be on the lookout for. If the rains continue, although I'm not sure how much it's going to affect them now because our leaves are pretty much developed and hardened off, but this dry spring may have an advantage in having fewer leaf spots on our maples, such as the Philosticta leaf spot and the different anthracnose fungi. But fortunately, when we do have them even, they are typically just an aesthetic problem and not going to affect the health of the tree in the long run. Turning to the vegetable garden, blossom end rot, of course, the localized calcium deficiency. We all know it in tomatoes, but it can occur in, for example, peppers here as well, as you see on the right. And in tomatoes for June, we want to look out for septoria leaf spot, tomato spotted wilt virus. Notice how the second one of those, you could see the spotting up on the newer growth, whereas the septoria, it's going to only start and move its way up from the older growth. And we might be starting to get into the time where we'll see wilting from southern bacterial wilt, from southern stem blight. Oh, and I should toss in a picture here of the fruit symptoms of tomato spotted wilt virus, and spots, even ring spots. I won't do much with turf. I'm not all that knowledgeable. I get my turf information from the very reliable Lee Butler, and I just want to mention two things. One is that brown patch we'll be starting to see, which is a warm season disease of cool season turf. So when the turf is under stress, it tends to have problems. This is caused by rhizoctonia. And another one we'll be starting to see more, not just the fairy rings, the green rings, or dead rings or arcs, but we'll be starting to see the mushrooms and puffballs coming up in the lawn. If there's been a question of an ingestion, a dog, or worse yet, a child who's eaten something that grew up, you can send us photos through our system and we'll alert the macrofungi experts. Another thing that we'll be seeing will be the Fuligo septica, the dog vomit slime mold. It starts out kind of a frothy looking yellow color, and eventually develops a pinkish crust with the black spores inside. This is harmless. It will not be a plant pathogen. It's not going to damage the plants, and it is not dangerous. Interesting picture here of one that kind of oozed up onto a brick wall there before switching over to its spore bearing stage. So not necessarily even on mulch will you find it. And as always, if you haven't had your fill of BOLOs, we do have our Be on the Lookout page or sub-page within our website there, and check it out. Oh, I forgot one thing. Barb mentioned elm yellows as a phloem inhabiting pathogen. It's a phytoplasma. And for some reason, I don't think it's ever been seen in North Carolina. It's been known in Tennessee since many years, but I don't know, something about the North Carolina state line there that's been very effective in keeping that particular disease out. I don't know, but I am unfamiliar with it ever being reported in North Carolina. All right.
All right, thank you, Mike. I just had somebody email me a picture of the dog vomit slime mold this morning. So definitely the weather for that. We will finish up today with talking about our Plant These for Pollinators plant. And of course, just a reminder, the Plant These for Pollinators slides are available to you as extension professionals and master gardener volunteers to use for extension programming. And if you want to maximize your pollinator habitat in your landscape or any landscape, aim to have multiple plants blooming all throughout the growing season. So Plant These for Pollinators features plants for the current month or upcoming month that will be in bloom and will be good for pollinators. And this month, late May, kind of looking towards June, we're going to talk about threadleaf Coreopsis. And you probably have always known this plant as Coreopsis, but it did recently have a name change. It is now Anasis verticillata. So the species name stayed the same, the genus changed, but they're keeping the common name as Coreopsis. So still referring to it as threadleaf Coreopsis, or sometimes called tick seed. And that is because the seeds look a little bit like ticks, not because the plants themselves attract ticks in any way. But threadleaf Coreopsis anasis verticillata. And I wanted to feature this one because it is a long-lived perennial, but there are many Coreopsis that are short-lived. And that kind of gives the long-lived perennial ones a bad reputation. And a lot of people will think, oh, I don't want to plant Coreopsis because it's short-lived. Now, the short-lived ones certainly have their place and are beautiful plants. But if you are looking to add something to your landscape that will be very long-lived, long-blooming, and will provide resources for pollinators, and you're looking for something that is both drought tolerant and has the bonus of being quite deer resistant, this is the perfect plant, threadleaf Coreopsis. It has bright yellow flowers. It started blooming now. It'll keep blooming for several weeks, usually on into July. It is one of several Coreopsis species that are native to the southeastern United States. All of them tend to have yellow, either these bright yellow flowers or kind of a brassy, more gold yellow, some of them verging on a kind of an orangish yellow. There's a pink one, and there's some other species, some out in the Great Plains that are more annual that have some mahogany colors on them. But all of our threadleaf Coreopsis are these bright yellows, and they are best for full sun. So they thrive in sun, well-drained soil, and again, very drought resistant. They have this very fine foliage, which gives them the common name threadleaf. And that reduced leaf area is one thing that helps them survive drought. The other thing that can be confusing when we talk about plants and say they need well-drained soil, people will think, well, I have clay, and clay's not well-drained. But really, if you have clay that has these bright red and orange colors in it, that is considered well-drained. That color in the soil comes from iron, literally from rust, from iron being exposed to oxygen. So in order for that to happen, there has to be good drainage or good internal drainage. So these orange clays would be a great place for threadleaf Coreopsis, as well as our sandier soils or any well-drained soil across the state. And these Coreopsis, maybe they aren't necessarily known for the plant that's got tons of pollinators on them, but they are often touted for the variety of pollinators that they attract. We'll look at that a little bit in just a minute. So threadleaf Coreopsis itself does occur in North Carolina. It's mostly native to North Carolina and Virginia. The wild form is somewhat open and airy. The one in the picture here is a cultivar or a selected variety. So the wild form, usually if you wanted just the wild species, you'd have to seek that out from a nursery that's specialized in native plants, but it'll grow to about 30 inches tall, maybe a little taller, and it'll be, like I said, just kind of open, airy, kind of wispy looking, but same golden, bright yellow flowers. And all of the Coreopsis verticillata are rhizomatous, but don't let that frighten you. They're not long rhizomes, they're short rhizomes. So it stays in a kind of a mat. You can think of it as a spreading mat that over the years gets a little wider and wider. It's not shooting pieces up far away like mint or something like that. So it's very easy to manage, and it just kind of stays in place but gets a little wider each year. And most of the time, if you go to a garden center or a place, a nursery that especially carries a good range of perennials, you'll find some of the cultivars. So the one pictured here is Zagreb. which is one of the more popular ones because it is quite compact, as you can see in the picture, and dense. It'll get to be about 18 inches tall. This one's kind of cascading a little bit over the edge of a bed, but generally it tends to be very compact, very dense, with all the flowers up along the top of the foliage, and can make quite a show for several weeks in the early summer and into midsummer. There is another variety named Golden Gain, which if you're kind of going for a little bit more towards that wild look, it's a little bit taller and a little bit looser growing. It's kind of halfway between Zagreb and the wild species, so that would be one to look out for. And you may have heard of a variety named Moonbeam, which has pale yellow flowers. And it may either be verticillata or a hybrid of verticillata. I think it's more likely a hybrid of verticillata, but that one isn't as persistent or as heat tolerant here in the South. So I would stick to either the Zagreb or Golden Gain, the bright yellow varieties, for long-lived, if you're really looking for that long-lived perennial. I did want to mention there are some other perennial Coreopsis. So Anasis verticillata or the Threadleaf Coreopsis is not the only one that's a reliable perennial. Some others, if you're looking to add yellow flowers to your summer and fall landscapes to look out for, would be tall Coreopsis, Anasis tripteris. That's another one that's had the genus name change, which is pictured here, living up to its common name of being tall. It will grow 7 to 10 feet tall, so this is one you'll likely need to stake, and it blooms later in the summer. It prefers moist soil, so when you're looking at Coreopsis, be sure to pay attention to what conditions they like, because it does vary a bit, although all of them prefer sun. Some of them like the drier, more well-drained sites. Some of them are happier where it's moist and rich soil. And another one you may see on the roadsides through much of North Carolina is called World Coreopsis, Anasis major. Looks quite similar to tall Coreopsis, but just on a much smaller scale. It gets to be about 2 feet tall, and it is just exceptionally tough. You don't see that for sale at a lot of garden centers. Again, you could find it at places that specialize in native plants, but I think that's the one thing that stands out about it is it will grow at the edge of the woods in part shade, very dry conditions, and still grow and bloom. So if you have that really tough spot, it might be one worth looking for. And then last, I wanted to mention swamp Coreopsis, Coreopsis palustris, which really stands out because it blooms in the fall. And you don't really think of Coreopsis as being a fall bloomer. It blooms in the fall and has a darker center in the eye. And it's one that likes moist soil, as you can tell by the common name. And it actually stayed in the genus Coreopsis. So some of our Coreopsis were split out into the genus Anasis. Some stayed Coreopsis. This one stayed Coreopsis. So look out for those perennial Coreopsis to add to your landscape. For pollinators, you can really dig into the different Coreopsis species through this excellent, very detailed report from the Mount Cuba Center, which is located in Delaware, and they do trials of different plants, especially those native to the Mid-Atlantic region. They trialed 94 different types of Coreopsis. That includes species and cultivars over 3 years. They go into a lot of detail about which ones really should just be considered annuals and which are perennials, and then of the ones that are perennials, which were the best performers in landscape conditions. They also talk about the diversity of pollinators found on Coreopsis or visiting Coreopsis. And this is just a chart that was a graph that's in the report where you can see there's bumblebees, which is the orange, and honeybees will visit the flowers, different types of sweat bees, hoverflies, wasps, and other pollinators. So that just kind of speaks to the diversity of pollinators that'll come along to Coreopsis blooms. And in fact, when I went out to look at Coreopsis in my landscape and take a picture, I remember thinking, I don't see a lot of bees on Coreopsis. And then I looked closer, and lo and behold, there were bees on several of the flowers. You just had to look close because they were quite small, and you can see, and they're very similar in color to the Coreopsis itself. So you can see this, one of our little native bees here in the center of the Coreopsis flower, which is like the size of a little bit bigger than a pencil eraser. And you can even see it has these quite full pollen baskets on its legs. So it's obviously finding lots of pollen. So look a little closer if you're thinking you're not seeing a lot of pollinators on your Coreopsis. And of course, we have a whole slew of different Coreopsis species in the plant toolbox where you can see lots of images and learn more about them and share those links with others. So we'll wrap up with just a few announcements on these, or mostly on this webinar is on the EMG Internet calendar, Designing Your Garden with Native Plants. This is just a continuing education webinar on July 14th. We're excited we'll be joined by Logan Clark, who is with Arrowhead Landscaping, to talk about using native plants in your landscapes. And kind of a follow-up from our Day of Giving, which was an extreme success. We really appreciate everybody who donated this year. But if you missed out on our special webinar with Dr. Dan Potter, who talked about trees for bees, it is posted on the EMG Internet, so you can watch that recording, learn about great trees for supporting pollinators, and pair that with your knowledge gained today from Dr. Barb Fair, and you will know how to both select the right varieties and now care for them so that they will be there to provide resources for many years. We mentioned at the opening the Great Southeast Pollinator Census, so just wanted to refresh everybody, August 21st and 22nd. And the goals this year are to exceed 10,000 counts. I think there were over 5,000 last year at least, and to have counts submitted from all 100 counties. We're close. Last year we had 92 different people from 92 different counties submit counts. So there's still a few out there. We're hoping to get involved. So we hope you can be part of that. Again, Amanda Bratcher, who is the Extension Horticulture Agent in Lee County, also serves as the coordinator for the Great Southeast Pollinator Census in North Carolina. She held a wonderful webinar on April 15th, just talking about how you can get started and involved with the Great Southeast Pollinator Census. That recording is available. She has other great webinars lined up. On July 16th, we'll be getting to know the insects, so learning some tips for how to identify the different insects by the categories that they are reported in the census. You can register to get the Zoom link. Also, Knowledge is Pollinator Power, a census pep rally webinar on August 13th. So that will be just before the webinar. And that will bring in some of the people who are involved in pollinator research to really bring you some of the latest research on what's going on in pollinators in the Southeast. So another one, if you register for the link, and you can find information about those on the Great Southeast Pollinator Census NC website. All of these links will be included in the resource doc that goes out with the recording. And next month, we're really looking forward to Matt and Mike sharing garden myths and misconceptions with us. So these will be some of those things you see online and hear passed around, and they're gonna explore some of those and talk about why they're not true and what we should be doing, hopefully, to grow healthy plants. So we appreciate everybody being here today, and I hope you have a great start to summer with June coming up soon, and we will look forward to seeing you in June.